The story of Upbuild began in a monastery. On our quest to understand ourselves more deeply, we recognize that it is our attachment to our egos, our identities, that gets in the way of being our true selves. This podcast will help you understand your ego. It will help you better understand your inner world, the motivations, insecurities, and emotions that affect your every action and relationship. Welcome to Upbuilding the Self.
Hey, welcome to our Upbuild podcast. I'm really happy to be here with you, Michael. We have a very special discussion topic today. You had recently released The Oldest Profession in the World, a reflection that you had written, which for me was honestly one of the best pieces of writing I've come across, that speaks about the nature of the ego in response to a particular question. And that question reveals the underpinnings of the ego in an exceptional way. So I would love to get into it with you. I've been really looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. And thank you very much for inspiring this topic for our conversation here today. The piece deals with a very simple and very common question. The question, how are you? Which is such a standard question to ask at the beginning of any meeting with someone, whether it's somebody who you've known forever or you're just meeting for the first time. And yet, when I actually thought about it and reflected on some of my own feelings when I get asked this question, it's an extremely complex question because there are really a million different ways you can go.
Yeah, how are you? You never know whether the person really wants to hear or not, right? I often think about how in Europe, when somebody asks, how are you? The person answers that, like, it stops the person in their tracks, and they're kind of like, well, and they have to gather a response, and it's usually something a little bit more authentic, I would say, or runs a little bit deeper than what we're accustomed to in the United States, for example. They take the question seriously. Whereas here, it's more of a figure of speech. It's a polite way of just greeting somebody. And then it's up to us whether we really want to answer that question. And I loved how you had taken that and used that as an introspection to really process the variety, the spectrum of different answers that you've given to that question. So maybe you could walk us through that spectrum, or at least give us a taste of some of those answers and what that signaled to you, why that inspired you to write this.
One of the things that I'll often do when somebody asks me, how are you, is I will just say the word good reflexively, because that feels very comfortable. Usually I will then go ahead and mention what's been keeping me occupied from a work perspective. So the first response I write about in the piece is, good, a really cool startup just hired us to do some consulting work, and I've been super busy with that. There's all sorts of variations of that response, but the translation of that is, things are going really well at work, business is booming, look at how good we're doing. And then also I'm really busy, so that must mean that I'm important.
What would make you respond in that way versus another way? Because you're making a choice anytime you're asked that question, and you have an arsenal of responses. So what's happening when you decide, I'm going to do this and not this? You mentioned, for example, in your piece that you'll want to share with people how spiritual you are sometimes. So what's behind? How do you choose? What's your response going to be to that question?
Well, the word chameleonic definitely comes to mind in this context. And another response might be, good, I just did a meditation retreat recently, so I'm feeling very zen. I might speak about the weather and how it's been really great recently. And all of those things, I'm often catering to my audience. So I'm often thinking, first of all, what would this person be interested in? There's a sweetness, I think, to that piece of it. But then, the next layer of it, if I'm really being honest and peeling back the onion here, the next layer would be, what do I want this person to think about me? So if I know that the person I'm speaking to values spiritual practices, for example, then speaking about my meditation retreat, even if it was 4 weeks ago, and even if I'm not feeling particularly zen in the moment that I'm conveying the message, that I know that I'm going to get not only connection, but validation.
That's so helpful. And I'm reminded of, in our workshops, we like to share, and I appreciate the way that Rasana in particular frames it, that there's a difference between adaptability and chameleonism. When we're adaptable, we're thinking, I want to tailor my message to where the person is at. I want to share and connect based on the other person and really serve that person. So I'm putting that person first, but I'm not changing myself and I'm not changing my message. It just has a different quality of flavor to it. But the actual message and me, most importantly, we are the same. When it comes to a lower level of consciousness, we call the controlling consciousness, then it is about changing myself to match what the other person wants for the sake of the validation, as you described. And that ties really beautifully to your title of the piece, the really provocative, striking, and memorable title, The Oldest Profession in the World. Would you share some more about that?
Sure. The reference there is, of course, to the oldest profession in the world being one where the product that the person is selling is themselves. And so in answering this question, how are you, in very chameleonic ways, the undertone is that I'm trying to sell myself to the person who is asking the question. And one of the really interesting things here is the question itself is, how are you? How are you doing? It's not what are you doing? And yet, at least my own experience is I'm often answering the question, what have you been doing recently, as a way to justify my existence on this planet, almost to give myself a sense of worth and give myself a sense of worth in the eyes of the other person. And hopefully they'll reflect that back to me. And then I can more viscerally feel my own self-worth. We often talk about this as well in our workshops for the threes on the Enneagram. You know, they're often human doings rather than human beings. And that's such a critical piece here, is to remember that when somebody is asking you, how are you? They want to know about your being rather than your doing.
I also like this question that I learned from a fellow student of nonviolent communication. I've been studying nonviolent communication after wanting to do so for many, many years since I was a monk, and finally getting the opportunity. And this very wise person, who's also been part of our Upbuild community recently, he shared with me, he feels like the question, how are you, is kind of rigged to elicit responses that don't go the distance, that don't really touch on what's inside of us and what can connect meaningfully with somebody else. So he was saying that, how are you feeling? How are you feeling is more beneficial. But even that gets you to, well, I'm doing well, I'm feeling good, and there's kind of a judgment to it. And then maybe you try to explain that. And so he said, a level up from that is, what are you feeling? What are you feeling? Not how are you feeling? Not like, oh, I evaluate that I'm feeling well or not well. But what is it that you're feeling? And Marshall Rosenberg, the founding father of nonviolent communication, is quite a remarkable person. He would ask this question, what is alive in you? What is alive in you right now? And I was touched by that idea. What is alive in you right now? And what is it that you're feeling is another way of expressing that.
I love both of those, because there's the timeliness. When somebody's asking, how are you? The implication is that, how are you in this moment? But we often allow ourselves to answer the question about how we were doing in some past moment. maybe when I was experiencing that Zen from the meditation retreat, but I kind of want to feel that now, but I'm very unlikely to be feeling that same Zen right now. But I still answer the question as if I was back in that moment. And when you ask the question, what's alive in you, even if you don't say what's alive in you right now, the word alive is very much a reference to this present moment. I think it encourages one to actually take a moment to check in with themselves.
Yes, that's very, very good. Yes, definitely. And I think you can still try to sell somebody with the answers to those questions. It may just be a little bit more roundabout. It may require more wherewithal, perhaps, than we have in that moment, especially if we're trying to be sincere and somebody asks us a question like that. Another one that comes to my mind, a mentor who I often reference from our spiritual tradition, Ravindra Swarup Prabhu, says that the most beneficial question you can ask somebody is, what are you going through? What are you going through? Then, wow, you really, now we're getting somewhere. This is like, and talk about vulnerability as a means of connecting and unity around vulnerability. It's really powerful. So you can still tailor your answer to sell the other person on your ego and try to get their validation and feel like I'm worth something. But it's just more roundabout. It's harder to do that because the question is disarming.
Yeah. And your mom shared that question, what are you going through, with our team a few months ago? And that has stuck very deeply in my consciousness. And I always, when I'm with a friend and I feel comfortable, and it wouldn't be, because there's something a little shocking about that question, especially if you're expecting sort of a canned, how are you, in an interaction. But I have used it a couple of times with close friends, and it automatically sinks us into connection, which is so beautiful. It also prevents those very canned one-word answers, words like, I'm doing fine, or surviving, or hanging in there, things that are just like very generic and not that interesting. And there's one of two things that are happening in those situations, at least for me. The first is that I don't want to make this other person uncomfortable. At least that's what I'm telling myself. They probably don't want a deeper answer from me. So let me just say something that's fine. And then we can, especially if I have an agenda or there's some business at hand to be covered, it will allow us to quickly transition from the niceties into that. So I don't want to rock the boat too much. The thing that you have to see in that scenario is am I really doing this for the benefit of the other person? And if the answer is yes, fantastic. If that's the intention, maybe you're very aware that this person is actually going through a struggle, and that bringing up any sort of deep emotional conversation right now would be a disservice to that person. So if you've really thought through that scenario, I think those one-word answers are fine because you have clear intention to serve the other person. But if you're actually looking at what's happening, most of the time it's, I don't want to be uncomfortable, or I don't want to take the risk of putting myself out there and not being received in the exact precise way that would make me feel good. And I think when you are trying to escape that, that's where you're not doing anybody a service.
That's fantastic. That's so well said. Absolutely. I'm thinking about Marshall Rosenberg would say that actually the purpose of nonviolent communication is just deeper connection. Really connection, almost his intention was a kind of soul-to-soul connection in a way. And you have the option to say, you know what, I have a need right now that is preventing me from wanting to connect deeper, or it may not make sense in this situation to connect in that way. So I might not go there. I mean, the last thing we want is for everybody to be forced into conversations that are like, how are you really doing? How are you really? No, tell me. I want to know. That would be highly uncomfortable and not really a service. And it's also impractical, right? Like, we're not able to do that with everybody all the time. And so certain people will take advantage. So recognizing that there is freedom here, But I think what you said is so important about the intentionality. We're making these decisions so unconsciously, and that's the problem. And then we're longing, we're hungering for connection, and we're not getting it. And sometimes we convince ourselves that we are getting it when it's really surface and it doesn't fulfill us. So that point about intentionality and just seeing what's going on inside of me and how can I serve the other person and what are my needs, I think that really changes the game. It's being conscious. And you mentioned this in your piece, that it's really, when you talk about, so what do we do about this dynamic of I'm trying to sell myself all the time with the answer to this question. And you put yourself in this very vulnerable, honest, really admirable position. But we know that that's universal. I mean, there's nobody who's not doing this in some way, shape, or form. And, we have different personality types, which make it look and feel very different. But in some way, we're all trying to sell people on our egos. Oh, I'm the most peaceful person. I'm the most reliable person. You can count on me. I'm the most humble person. Nothing to see here. I'm humble. Don't you like me for that? I'm the most helpful. I'm all about you. Don't you love that? Don't you need somebody who's really just there for you all the time? Nothing to do with me, but don't you like that about me? Right? So everybody's trying to do that. And your answer to what can we do about this is so helpful in terms of just raising awareness. And I would love for you to share more about what that's like.
The ego, at least what I was able to see through kind of dissecting this question, was that it wants a lot of things, but the three things that came to mind here were validation, control, and comfort. And the ego is often angling for all three of these things. We can stop and take a second, and this is where we can make the distinction between the true self and the ego. The ego always has something to prove, and the true self actually has nothing to prove. We can take a second, and this is very helpful for seeing the ego's need for validation, the first piece, and just ask ourselves, what am I trying to prove to this person in this moment through this answer? How do I want them to see me? What do I want them to know about me? And why do I want them to know about this? And in that moment, we might get a glimpse of our ego. We might get a glimpse of something we are trying to prove, where we actually don't need to do that because we're already whole. And imagine if we could offer that to ourselves as well. Then we would not need to respond from the place of the ego. We would not need to prove anything to this other person through our answer to the question, how are you? We could simply just answer the question.
Yeah. And to me, at least, that brings us to the corridor of spirituality, because practically speaking, at least I can say for myself, I do feel very broken a lot. I would say all the time, I have the sense of incompleteness and the sense of I'm not living up to my fullest potential. And I feel the blocks and I see the blocks, and it's so frustrating. And I walk through my life wondering, why am I being held back? It's so painful. So if I were to tell myself, well, I'm whole and complete, there's another voice that would say, okay, oh yeah, prove it. How can you prove that to me? I don't feel that. That's not how I feel at all. And that's why I say, I think that brings us into the corridor of spirituality, because it's touching on a deeper truth that most of us don't access. I'm curious if you also find that to be the case, and if you could shed some more light on that.
It's a battle to know that intellectually, and then the feeling deeply of that and actually experiencing that on a body and a soul level is something that's very different. And yet I've had glimpses into that. It's not a common experience, especially in the world of work and busyness and go, and all the worlds that I've been a part of that are very ego-driven worlds. But I have had those moments in, various states of contemplation, after exercise, sometimes while traveling. and just, in solitude. And so those have carried me enough where if I'm able to, even with an intellectual question, like, what am I trying to prove here? Even if I'm not viscerally feeling that wholeness and completeness in that moment, it can be enough to actually rethink how I want to respond. And this is going back a little bit to the second reason why we often come up with a very canned generic response, such as fine or surviving, is because we actually haven't looked inside ourselves to be able to answer the question. We actually have no idea how we are doing, which is crazy. But unless you actually look inside your heart, how are you supposed to know? Because that's where that comes from. And so taking a moment to actually check in with your heart and reconnect to that piece of you that knows that you're whole and complete, even if you might not be feeling it in that moment when you're asked the question, both of those things can be very, very beneficial.
Wonderful. And that point that you made about not knowing how you're feeling in your reflection was very poignant. And it's such a reminder for us to make sure that we do check in with ourselves, that we're not just going out into the world and losing ourselves all the time, which is a conditioning, a tendency, and almost what the world expects of us, which is so painful and sad. I mean, that's not bringing out our potential, though externally it feels like, productivity and so on, but that's not really what our hearts are craving or what we can do, what we can offer for the world. And back to this spiritual subject, my own experience is that I can tell myself I'm whole and complete, but I need to experience that. Otherwise, it's just a concept. And the experience, for me, I actually like what you talked about with even from like exercising or meditating or being in a more peaceful and contemplative state. It allows you sort of the freedom to experience more of yourself. And the Bhagavad Gita speaks about that as the mode of goodness, a way of living that is good, that is beneficial, that is healthy, that is elevating of our consciousness and allows us to experience more of ourselves and more of life, more of reality, which is very powerful. And it's closer actually to the soul. My guru's guru, Srila Prabhupada, says that the soul acts for all intents and purposes in the mode of goodness. So it's very, very beneficial to raise the consciousness in that way and to have habits that bring us to that point. And then for me, even more importantly, is a spiritual practice which brings that even deeper into focus, that connects most directly with the real self. And suddenly it's not a concept anymore. It's not something I'm trying to sell myself on that, yes, I'm whole and complete. Yes, I'm whole and complete. By the way, remember, affirm, I'm whole and complete. Today I tell myself, I am whole and complete. It becomes something which is felt and is not an abstraction, but which is very close to my heart. And you and I were speaking about this just before our podcast. It was a really very touching little exchange about how we both were experiencing more of our real self this week, even in certain cases, in spite of the pressures of life and our nerves and, things not going our way. And for me, feeling like, oh my God, another impossible day. How am I going to get through? It makes no sense, but here we are. I mean, I'm excited about everything in the day, but the cumulative effect of it is making me feel really out of control. And the chaos creates a lot of pressure, and I don't get to pour myself into my spiritual practices in a way that will do me justice. So I really feel that. And yet, from having done spiritual practices, engaging in sangha or company with persons who are living as the soul, or even endeavoring very sincerely and having experiences on the level of the soul, I found that I'm being carried, and that wholeness and completeness, while I'm experiencing so many other things beside that, I can also feel some of that in a way that I don't usually.
It's beautiful. It speaks to that we can put a little distance between ourselves and our ego. Even if we do answer the question, by proving or trying to make the other person comfortable, trying to make ourselves comfortable, even if we're going for control and trying to, make sure that the response that this other person gives us is one that we're going to feel well received in, that we can also remember that that is the work of our ego and that is not the work of our true selves. And so we don't have to feel so bad about those responses. We can offer ourselves a little bit of forgiveness, see the underlying motivations for why our ego did respond in that way. And then, and this is so important, recommit every single day, even every single hour. May not be practical, but just recommitting all the time to not living the life of the ego and instead living the life of the soul, and actually trying for that connection, trying for that service, and being very much in touch with our hearts as we are communicating with others.
Beautiful. Yes. I mean, it's so well said. And I think that also, again, is driven home so aptly at the end of your piece, The Oldest Profession in the World, that let us really just see our egos, not take it so seriously, not worry if we're angling for validation, control, comfort. Ultimately, it's all about validation, right? But those three different flavors, straight on or comfort and control, and let us be in touch with our real self. And as you said, even if we do go off the rails a little bit, remembering, hey, that's not me. It's all right. It's not me. And then, what a relief. Oh my God, I made a mistake, or I acted as the ego, but I'm not bound to that because I know that's not me. And ultimately, I don't have to stay with that. So is there anything else that you would just want to share in closing?
The only other thing, which I didn't include in the piece, but it's striking me right in this moment, is when somebody asks, how are you? It's okay to answer in a more negative, and I put negative in quotation marks here, fashion, because we all are experiencing some sort of suffering. We all are experiencing some sort of grief or loneliness. And we need a forum to be able to speak about this stuff. If it feels right, let us go to that place where we say, I'm feeling lonely, this is what's been going on recently, or I'm not doing so great, and seeing where the conversations go from that point, because the I'm doing good, I'm doing fine, mild positivity is often the kind of most right place for non-authenticity to take place.
Thank you so much. This has been a great joy. I feel so impassioned about the subject, about what you wrote, and I'm feeling carried by the energy of this conversation. I hope that these realizations can help many others.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Upbuilding the Self. Upbuild is a leadership development company that offers workshops, coaching, and other services to help you on the path towards being your best self, free from the shackles of the ego. To learn more about our work, visit our website, upbuild.com, and sign up for our newsletter to gain access to podcasts, reflections, and upcoming events. If you enjoyed this episode, please go to iTunes to leave us a review so that others can find and benefit from the podcast. We look forward to being with you again next time.